Hi everyone and welcome to Datamonitor Healthcare's webinar on the asthma market dynamics. Today I'll be discussing the current and future treatment landscape in asthma, and in particular I will focus on the use of biologics, generic combination inhalers, as well as reimbursement and market access restrictions. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how to participate in today's webinar. First, you should have a control panel on the right side of your screen. Towards the bottom of the control panel is the Q&A panel. All viewers will be on mute throughout the webinar, but you may submit questions or comments in writing using the Q&A panel during the presentation. All answers to your questions will be given after the webinar by email. So today's webinar is being recorded and the slides will be available upon request and additionally hosted on our service for subscribers. My name is Christina Vasiliou. I'm a senior analyst at Datamonitor Healthcare, and I will be your presenter today. So just to provide you with an overview of today's presentation, I'll begin with a brief look at asthma. So we will look at asthma from a clinical and epidemiological perspective. For example, the disease diagnosis, its risk factors, prevalence, and we will also look at patient segmentation by severity. I'll then move on to examine the treatment of asthma as recommended by current guidelines and look at how existing therapies are currently being prescribed. I'll then provide key insights from our patient-based forecast for asthma, what assumptions are driving it, and what it means for those of you interested and invested in the asthma therapy space. I'll focus on the use of generic versions of key branded combination inhalers and the increasing availability of biologic therapies. Furthermore, as I'm sure you're aware, no discussion of the current and future asthma climate is complete without examining the payer's perspective and looking at reimbursement and market access restrictions. So starting with an overview of the disease. So asthma is a chronic respiratory disease that's characterized by recurrent breathlessness and wheezing. That is known as asthma attacks, and asthma attacks can vary significantly by frequency and severity. So currently there is no gold standard in diagnosing asthma, although bronchial challenge tests and spirometry can be used to diagnose asthma. The reversibility test is often used in combination with spirometry in order to distinguish between asthma and other lung conditions, including COPD. One of the key unmet needs in asthma, as reported by secondary sources and our 2015 survey of pulmonologists and primary care physicians, is the fact that the high rate of asthma patients remain undiagnosed, particularly those with milder disease. There are certain factors associated with an increased risk of asthma, and these include genetic factors such as gender and age. For example, up until puberty, the prevalence of asthma is higher in boys than in girls, with more severe disease seen in boys. After puberty, the prevalence of asthma is greater in women until menopause, where the difference in prevalence becomes smaller. Environmental factors, as well as dietary changes and obesity, have also been linked to increased rates of asthma. So let's now turn to look at the prevalence of asthma in the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets up until 2034, as estimated by our in-house epidemiology team. Since the risk factors of asthma are expected to remain mostly stable, the estimated changes in the number of diagnosed prevalent cases over the forecast period are largely due to overall changes in population numbers. Our epidemiology team estimates that asthma prevalence is highest in the US, and the US is forecast to see the most significant growth in the asthma population over the forecast period, mainly due to the much larger overall population in the US compared to other analyzed markets. The number of prevalent cases in the 5 major EU markets is also estimated to see an overall increase in the future, while in Japan there will be a marginal decrease in the prevalent cases, and this is because the overall Japanese population is expected to decrease in the next decade, and the country will be characterized by an aging population. So the overall expected increase in asthma cases highlights the fact that not only is there currently a need for effective asthma therapies, but the need is going to grow in the future, making the commercial opportunity for asthma treatment greater. Our epidemiology team has also segmented the diagnosed prevalent asthma population by severity, with 4 different levels of severity: intermittent asthma, mild, moderate, and severe persistent asthma. As you can see, intermittent asthma makes up nearly half of the diagnosed cases, and I will discuss the significance of this more later on. Turning to see how asthma is actually treated, we can see that patients with asthma are treated in a stepwise approach, with patients being initially treated with the first lines of therapy, and then treatment progressing if their asthma is uncontrolled. In general, based on the latest GINA guidelines, patients are initially treated with a short-acting beta-2 agonist, or SABA, on a when required basis. If this is inadequate, regular low-dose inhaled corticosteroid therapy, or ICS therapy, will be added. If their asthma is still not controlled, treatment is switched to a low-dose inhaled corticosteroid and long-acting beta-2 agonist combination inhaler, also known as ICS LABA, as a maintenance regime, with SABA usage when required. If patients are still not controlled, treatment will be escalated to either greater dosing of corticosteroid therapy and bronchodilator therapy, or in the most severe cases, patients will be referred to a specialist and a biologic can be added. A long-acting muscarinic antagonist, such as tiotropium, or oral corticosteroids can be introduced as add-on therapies in severe patients. So in order to gain an understanding of how current treatment options are used in real clinical practice, we conducted a survey of 229 pulmonologists and primary care physicians across the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets, and we used the data from this survey to build treatment trees for the market analysts. To do this, we started by determining what proportion of patients falls into each disease severity with the help of our epidemiology team. And for each severity, we worked out the proportions of patients that are receiving treatment, accounting for those patients who are lost to follow-up, and what proportion of patients receiving treatment are treated with pharmacological therapies. So with this established, we can gain more granular insights from our surveyed physicians on what percentage of patients are receiving each of the therapies available on the market, which are then used to formulate our patient-based forecast. So now let's move on to see what proportion of patients at each disease severity receives the therapies we are interested in. Looking at the US treatment tree, it's clear that a high proportion of patients across all severities receive a SABA, which is in line with the guidelines discussed earlier, which recommend the use of SABAs on a when required basis for all patients. There are multiple SABAs available, and you can really see that the 2 leaders are Proventil and Ventolin, which is not surprising as they are the longest established SABAs. Generic albuterol is also available and captures just under a quarter of the SABA market in terms of patient numbers. This is quite interesting because it highlights the fact that with generic inhalers, you don't really see the typical generic erosion rates you observe with small molecule drugs, and this is something I'll come back to later on. Looking at the ICS LABA products, as a reminder, these are the fixed-dose combination inhalers which contain both an inhaled corticosteroid and a long-acting beta-2 agonist. So within the ICS LABA class, you can observe that there are 2 dominant brands, Advair and Symbicort, which have been available for use in asthma for over a decade. You can see that their use increases with severity, which is again in line with the treatment guidelines. It's also worth noting that when you look at something like standalone LABAs, such as Foradil and Serevent, you see minimal patient share for them, which really indicates that the combination products have almost completely eradicated the use of standalone LABAs. The other interesting product here is Xolair, which was the first biologic to be approved for use in asthma in 2003. As you can see, its use is primarily in the most severe cases, and this is mainly due to its high cost and reimbursement limitations, which we will talk about later, and also the fact that it has a restrictive label. So physicians therefore prescribe Xolair only in the most severe cases, which is again in accordance with the treatment guidelines. Now that we've looked at the current treatment trends, let's take a look at how the asthma market will change over the next decade. To do this, I'm just going to briefly outline our market forecast methodology. And some of this will be familiar from the prescribing trends section, as the first steps of the forecast methodology are derived from the treatment trends presented earlier. So I'll continue just from the point where we worked out the proportions of patients on each therapy. So to actually get a market forecast, we also layered in several other assumptions, which are shown in this figure. And these include market events such as the launch of new products, as well as the impact of generic launches, while we also factor in compliance and persistence rates. These assumptions were based on our 2015 survey of pulmonologists and primary care physicians, discussions with key opinion leaders, as well as our in-depth payer research. At this point, I should note that our market access team conducted in-depth interviews with 19 payers and payer advising key opinion leaders in the US and 5 major EU markets. And key findings from these interviews were incorporated in this forecast. And finally, to convert patient numbers to sales figures, we calculated the treatment costs. We used national formularies to gather pricing information for each product included in the forecast, and we used at least 4 years of historical pricing, which when trending future prices. So moving to the key findings of our forecast, so this figure here provides the top-level summary of asthma sales in the US, Japan, and 5 major EU markets over our forecast period of 2015 to 2024. So what's clear is that we do expect the overall market to increase, and one of the drivers of this market growth is the increasing asthma prevalence in the US, with therefore more patients needing therapy. We also anticipate annual price increases of branded therapies in the US, and most importantly, new biologic launches. And I'll talk more about how these high-cost biologic therapies are going to grow the market later on. While we do see an overall market growth, it should be noted that there is at least one key resistor to this market growth, and this will be the arrival of generic versions of leading ICS LABA brands, so generic versions of Advair and Symbicort. However, the genericization of the ICS LABA space is going to resemble more closely the market situation we've seen with SABAs rather than with typical small molecule generics. So, Advair generics are already available in Europe, with Sandoz and Vectura having launched a dry powder inhaler generic version of Advair, branded as Air Fluzal for Spiro in select EU markets, while Cipla and Mylan have also launched pressurized meter-dose inhaler generic versions of Advair, branded as Seroflo and Sirdupla in select EU markets. We expect DPI and PMDI generics to launch in the remaining major EU markets later this year. Advair generics are also on track to launch in the US. In fact, the FDA accepted Mylan's abbreviated new drug application submission for a generic DPI in Q1 2016, while we expect it to be approved in Q1 2017. It should be noted that Mylan has indicated it expects to gain an AB rating for its generic DPI, and what an AB rating would allow is substitution of Advair for Mylan's generic at the pharmacy level in accordance with state-level legislation. We also have Symbicort generics approved in Europe, namely Teva's Duoresp Spiromax, and while later arrival is expected in the US, we do expect Symbicort generics to launch during our forecast period. However, to date there has been blunted uptake of the generic ICS LABA inhalers in Europe, and payers highlight there are several reasons behind this. Firstly, within Europe, there is limited substitutability for branded inhalers. So right now at the pharmacy level, there is a lack of automatic substitution from the pharmacists. For example, in the UK, some regions recommend that ICS-LABA inhalers are prescribed by brand name, so patients continue to receive the same brand, while France, Italy, and Spain have actually banned automatic substitution. In Germany, while combination inhalers have not been added to the substitution exclusion list, which means they can, in theory, be substituted, there really is a lack of incentives to switch. Payers highlight that in terms of net cost, there really isn't a significant price differential between the original brands and their generic versions, and in fact, in some cases, the brands are continuing to win contracts. Furthermore, in France, each branded generic inhaler is actually assessed by the Transparency Commission as a new Me Too product, again posing additional hurdles for its reimbursement. The second reason behind the low uptake of generic ICS-LABAs is because physicians and patients are actually reluctant to switch devices. This is primarily due to the fact that there are concerns over the dose and efficacy equivalence between the brands and their generics, and patients may in fact be uncomfortable to use a new device compared to the one they have potentially a great deal of trust. Across Europe, payers tell us there are minimal price discounts for generic inhalers, just like the situation I mentioned in Germany, and if price discounts do exist, they are not substantial enough to undertake the costly managed switching programs which are needed for a large-scale switch to occur. Though, as always, pricing is likely to be country and indeed region-specific as well as device-specific. As ever, larger than average discounts may be observed in certain cases. But the key question is whether we are going to see similar levels of generic adoption in the largest market, the US. Based on our payer research, we actually anticipate that in the US there will be higher rates of generic adoption. The key reason driving this is that US payers are going to be in a position where they can actually incentivize the use of generic inhalers more easily than their European counterparts through formulary management mechanisms available, given there is a sufficient discount in the market. Unlike in Europe, we do believe that there are going to be sufficient discounts in the US, and if discounts of at least 20% are seen, US payers indicate they will use step therapy requirements as well as copay differentials to increase adoption of the generic combination inhalers. However, even in the US, existing patients will not be forced to switch to the generic versions. And again, similar to the situation in Europe, we expect physicians and patients to be reluctant to switch devices, though in cases where the patient may be financially incentivized to switch due to having a lower copay with the generic version, this is likely to have a persuasive influence on them actually wanting to switch themselves. And this is a factor which has been absent from Europe since copayments are minimal. So how does this actually play out? Well, even with the higher rates of generic adoption that are expected in the US compared to what has been observed to date in Europe, we still expect Advair and Symbicort to remain commercially relevant and successful, with them capturing more than 30% of the market share of all inhaled products in the out year of our forecast. As I noted earlier, the key driver of growth in the asthma space is going to be the increasing availability of biologic therapies, competing for patient share among patients with severe uncontrolled asthma. So the table here highlights biologics that are currently approved for use in asthma. So Xolair really occupied a unique position in the market since 2003, having been the first biologic licensed for asthma, and it had over a decade on the market to itself without any biologic competition. But in just over the last 6 months, competition has arrived in the form of 2 interleukin-5 antagonist monoclonal antibodies, GSK's Nucala and Teva's intravenous Cinqair, and both of them are targeting patients with severe asthma and with an eosinophilic phenotype. However, Nucala and Cinqair are not going to be the only near-term competition, since there is a crowded pipeline of several anti-interleukin-5 and anti-interleukin-13 inhibitors undergoing phase 3 trials, such as AstraZeneca's benralizumab and tralokinumab. Our analysis is largely focused on the interleukin-5 inhibitors as they are closer to the market and there is more data available on them. While interleukin-5 inhibitors are an obvious cause of excitement for potentially addressing a high burden in the treatment of asthma and enabling better patient care, for payers there is an obvious worry in terms of their impact on drug budgets. Payers do recognize the potential of biologics and consider the endpoints used in their phase 3 programs highly relevant. These endpoints include reductions in asthma exacerbations and hospitalizations. However, payers highlight that they only address a limited population subset and question their overall value. Some payers are also concerned about potential overprescribing of these costly therapies in an attempt to address the compliance issues in asthma, while optimization of inhaled therapies would be more appropriate. Some payers and key opinion leaders remain uncertain about the ideal place of interleukin-5 inhibitors in the treatment algorithm, especially relative to Xolair, and the extent of patient overlap between Xolair and the interleukin-5 biologics. And in some cases, this will result in payers being unable to accurately project budget the impact of these therapies. In general, epidemiological studies and forecasts are expected to influence price negotiations for the interleukin inhibitors. In all markets, we expect to see strict access controls to interleukin-5 inhibitors. In the US, payers are in fact implementing strict prior authorization criteria for the use of these therapies. While physician recommendation is sufficient in most cases, some plans may require documented evidence of eosinophil count. Based on this, earlier access to biologics is highly unlikely, and in fact, the use of these therapies will be reserved as last resort after patients fail treatment with high-dose inhaled corticosteroids with or without oral corticosteroids. What's interesting is that the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review judged that Nucala is overpriced and that it's more likely to be cost-effective at an annual cost of approximately $8,000 to $12,000 rather than its launch price of $32,000, especially as there is an overall uncertainty around the drug's long-term benefit due to the lack of data at the moment. In Europe, payers expect to use Xolair's price as a benchmark for the interleukin-5 inhibitors, even though Xolair is not a direct competitor, and expect Nucala to be priced in line with Xolair or below Xolair. Access restrictions for Nucala will also be modeled based on Xolair's case and could include the use of registries or therapeutic plans in Italy, outcome-based risk sharing in France and Italy, and patient access schemes in the UK. Not surprisingly, biologics will only be prescribed by specialists, which will further restrict patient access. EU payers also expect that there will be further assessment of the benefit biologics offer in specific patient subgroups. So, in summary, the interleukin inhibitors will grow the market, but relative to other therapy spaces where biologics are used, the sales of the biologics will be muted due to the limited population subset they target. From the late-phase biologics being developed for the treatment of asthma, we forecast AstraZeneca's benralizumab to see the greatest uptake, and there are two reasons behind this. Firstly, benralizumab demonstrated positive efficacy and safety in its phase 2b study, while it's also thought to have a faster onset of action compared to Nucala and Cinqair. Indeed, pulmonologists think benralizumab's faster onset of action will actually help differentiate it from other biologics under development. However, payers seem to have a different view. Payers do not consider this benefit of having a faster onset of action significant, and they don't expect it to lead to any pricing advantages for the drug. Instead, payers are more concerned about the long-term efficacy of benralizumab and all the interleukin-5 biologics. So, as I noted earlier, Teva's intravenous formulation of Cinqair received US approval earlier this year, and its subcutaneous formulation is currently in phase 3. Overall, we expect that Cinqair's less convenient intravenous formulation and its more restrictive label in the US, where it's approved for use in adults, while Nucala is also approved for use in adolescents, will have an overall negative impact on its potential. But what is interesting is that opinions on Cinqair's IV formulation vary among payers. So US payers consider the IV infusion fees to be negligible compared to the overall high cost of the drug, but are aware that pulmonologists may be reluctant to administer IV drugs. However, payers in Europe hold a more reserved outlook and expect the availability of infusion beds and the involvement of hospital personnel that will be a barrier. But overall, among interleukin-5 inhibitors, we expect Nucala to have a dominant position until benralizumab is launched. I earlier noted that there are a few interleukin-13 inhibitors under development for use in asthma, and I'd like to briefly comment on the example of Roche's lebrikizumab, which recently produced mixed results in its phase 3 program. So lebrikizumab's efficacy and safety was assessed in 2 identical randomized controlled trials in patients with severe uncontrolled asthma. The primary endpoint of the trials was the rate of asthma exacerbations over 52 weeks, and the endpoint assessment was based on patients with high periostin levels or blood eosinophils. However, only one study met the primary endpoint, and in fact, pulmonologists consider lebrikizumab's efficacy to be significantly lower compared to that of interleukin-5 inhibitors, even among patients with high periostin levels. Roche announced that further interpretation and analysis of the trial data is required, but given the mixed results so far, we don't provide a forecast for lebrikizumab at this time. To summarize the key points of today's webinar, we expect the overall asthma market to increase over the forecast period, and the key driver of this market growth is the increasing availability of biologic therapies. The late-phase pipeline for asthma has a strong focus on anti-interleukin-5 and interleukin-13 biologics, and while these biologics have the potential to address a high burden in the treatment of asthma, their prescribing will be restricted, mainly due to their high cost, and they will only be used in the very small subset of severe patients with uncontrolled asthma. However, their high cost also mean that they will still generate substantial revenue despite low patient numbers. Payers do recognize the potential of biologics, but are concerned about their impact on drug budgets and will implement strict access controls in all markets. Leading ICS-LABA brands are facing generic competition. However, the uptake of generic combination inhalers in the EU to date has been low, and there are a few reasons behind this. Firstly, there's a lack of automatic substitution in Europe, while the price discounts seen to date are not sufficient to incentivize the switch, and physicians and patients are concerned about switching devices. However, greater uptake is expected in the US, where payers will be in a position to incentivize the use of generic inhalers more easily through formulary management programs. Nevertheless, the leading brands Advair and Symbicort are expected to remain commercially successful. Finally, I'll just briefly run through where you can find Datamonitor Healthcare's asthma content on our side. So from our homepage, if you select disease, shown in the box there, and then select respiratory, and from the drop-down menu select asthma, you'll then reach the asthma landing page, and from there you can access all the modules like the patient-based forecast, treatment epidemiology, as well as our analysis of the marketed and pipeline drugs, along with any opinion pieces as the market evolves. While this presentation focused on marketed and late phase products, we also have an early phase forecast within our pipeline content. And this includes forecasts for phase 1 and phase 2 pipeline candidates to help you identify commercial opportunities in early phases. To access our asthma pricing and reimbursement content, you have to select strategy from our home page as shown here, and then market access and pricing and reimbursement. I should also note that we also have in-depth coverage of the COPD market, including a detailed pricing and reimbursement report on COPD. We have now come to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today, and if you have any further questions or comments, please email them to pharma@informa.com. Thank you all again and have a great